So as we move on to the governance section, I think what's important here is to talk about specifically what is climate governance, what at the top level are the responsibilities and expectations on the board as well as management. We'll talk a bit about, as Maheen did, some of the specifics for governance-related disclosures. And then we can also cover a bit of just guiding principles for effective governance, as I mentioned before, related to, but not dependent on disclosure. So if we go into this, we see this recognition that climate governance is a big item today, and there's a number of places where this is coming from. Some regulatorily, you can see this headline from the ECB. You can see others from looking at shareholders. You can see civil society playing a role as well. But there's more and more of a chorus speaking up about climate in the boardroom. And so you may have seen the news not that long ago of that small activist hedge fund, Engine One, getting 2 board seats at Exxon. Likewise, a number of attempts to kill shareholder resolutions by Chevron have been unsuccessful. And I think at the same time, we're not just talking about oil and gas companies. I think those are the obvious ones, but also other companies, especially in the financial space, this question of, well, what are you doing around climate? What is your climate strategy, going back to the last session? But also in terms of governance, how are you considering this at the board level? And that can be in terms of the people on the board. It can, and JP Morgan, this was one of the points, and you see it highlighted here. So Lee Raymond was the CEO of ExxonMobil. I think he was CEO actually when Exxon and Mobil merged at the time of that creation of the super majors, the ConocoPhillips and the other creations of these big oil and gas giants. But he has been on the JP Morgan board for, I want to say, 15 years or so. And there was really an increasing outcry of his role on that board because of his connection to Exxon and that relationship with JP Morgan continuing to fund and finance oil and gas. And I'm not here to take a position on whether people should or shouldn't be financing oil and gas, but rather to talk more normatively about what is going on, and more to say the expectation now is not just that a company puts together a presentation or has a nice ad campaign about climate, but really is integrating these pieces of strategy, but also that at the senior levels, those that represent the company and those that look out for its governance really are considerate and considering the impacts that are likely to be felt both as risks. And I think the governance pillar is an interesting one because I was on a call yesterday about the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And one of the co-chairs of the TNFD said, TNFD is different than TCFD because TCFD doesn't really concern itself with impact. And I don't agree with that. I think that, yes, fundamentally, we're looking at risk and about how the climate and the market can impact companies. But in terms of global emissions, in terms of this, emissions from different companies, that is one way that impact is considered. I think the governance pillar of all the pillars is probably the one that most explicitly talks about this role of impact. And it's not just enough to say, this is what the company has done, but rather what are the actions that are following that up to drive it forward? What are the steps that are being taken that are utterly essential to reducing climate footprints, to taking action on climate strategies? And I think in that way, it's not just does good governance help you manage risk? It absolutely does. But also, how does it lend coherence to your strategy? And so in this, describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities and describe management's role. You can see both on the board level and the management level a need for clearly defined responsibilities. And that can be at the individual level, or it can be at a committee level. And you'll see in a few of these examples as we go into them, where those manifest and how they look like they are being implemented. So when it comes to board engagement, I think one of the valuable things to ensure is that those who are on the board either have adequate training on the risks climate poses, as well as the ESG footprint of their institution, but also that maybe they come with some specific experience. And again, this isn't that everyone needs to have the same experiences. Part of the desire to build a board is to create diversities of viewpoints that are helpful to the company. And so at a starting point from the work we had done with the IIF, one of the expectations I think that's important to set is that there are clear chains of command. How is this brought up within the board? Where does this live as a item? Is there somebody who is chair of that topic? Is there a committee formed of a subgroup of board members? Is there a space on the agenda? And I think a lot of people, and to my mind, this is a mistake, a lot of people are very literalist, especially on this disclosure more than almost any others, by saying like, how many times does our board meet? Should we just put that down? We meet 4 times and twice we talk about climate. That's not really saying that much. I think, yes, in a very, very narrow sense, you're covering the question of do the board members bring this topic up? But I think if you go to these advanced considerations, I think there's a bit more of an opportunity to be expansive. What do those committees do? What is the actual remit and mandate? Saying we talked about something is nice, but right now we're talking about something. But I think part of the goal is for us to do something. So to my mind, it's not just where these committees sit, but also what they do. And in a broader sense, what is a kind of status report on where they have been and what initiatives have been led? And again, this isn't obviously to disclose anything that is non-public, but it is to, in the initiatives done, how were they done? Who is championing them? How does this, how do issues get resolved? So even if you're not going to go into specific examples for the board, what are the types of issues that the board looks to adjudicate? Or what are the types of questions? And then I think these questions of the more numerical, like, okay, well, it's great to have that in panel, but if they're never meeting, that's not so useful. So yeah, mentioning the numbers are helpful, but I think very often this kind of falls a little bit into a trap of people being too literalist. On this page, you can see a bit of an example of governance structure. It's a little bit tricky to see, but you can see some of the legal entities on the left-hand side and them rolling up. So where the main management positions sit. So the global head of ESG and the head of climate risk, who they report up to. And then at the board level, what is going on at the board level that is necessary. And so in the right hand, again, there's interesting material here, but more to the point, it's really to see the visuals of who are the particular reports, what is the committee structure. So you see these board committees on the one on the bottom right. You can also see at the management level their connections, and then around that you can see really pretty well-defined roles and responsibilities in the text itself. And again, it's less, although we are working on a paper on this around stress testing about roles and responsibilities and other aspects, it's not really our need here or desire to say, this is what the chief risk officer should or shouldn't do. We can talk about that, and if there are questions people have or ideas, that's a great topic. My purpose in bringing this up was more to just give a demonstration of what this tends to look like. Also on board engagements, you have this example from UBS, and what I like here is there's an explicit coverage of what the skills on the board are, as well as what are the experiences. And I think that this is just good governance across the board in an annual report as well. It's not just a TCFD piece, it's not just a standalone, but in terms of good governance, who knows about these topics? Who is on your board? What are the terms of those people that are on the board? I think all of these are important things. And again, it goes to this broader concept of taking climate metrics, climate considerations, and mainstreaming them, making them part of your disclosures, even if these things stand alone right now in a TCFD disclosure, or if they're integrated into an annual report. The idea should be that there is a standard expectation for how they are discussed and disclosed. And I think that is the key point as far as understanding what experiences the board has. Another piece, of course, is management's role. And one of the questions is specifically, okay, we've talked about the board and that broad experience, but for management, these are people that head up divisions. These are people that are in charge of products, are in charge of business lines. And very often what I've seen, at least, is when it comes to climate initiatives, they often succeed. I don't want to say succeed or fail, but the ones that often succeed because they have an executive champion. And I think that is really critical. Very often you see this in the case not only of the initiative itself, but just in the hiring for it. That, okay, you're the head of climate, but you're only an AVP, or you're the head of climate, but you're also split onto this. And I think that when you don't have an executive champion, and it doesn't mean that you need a chief risk officer to be your chief climate officer, that's hardly the point, but rather that there is someone at an executive level with the power to be seen as the leader of that initiative within the institution. I think that is really the crux of this, which is to say, at a management level, what are the responsibilities that everyone should have and should be able to take up, and what are the things that filter down from them in terms of their direct actions. So when it comes to management responsibilities, it's not just to be a champion, but what is the strategy and what are the practices you are going to put in place? And I think one of the areas that is really useful to explore is incentives. And I think that there's sometimes too much focus on incentives, on executive pay, and there's justifiable focus on them, but often it can distract from larger and more systemic issues. Whereas here, I think this is just the simplest way to look at it, but there are other incentives. What are the other upshots? What are the other benefits, both to management as well as to the organization overall, for achieving climate targets? So if we talked about in strategy, and we'll talk about tomorrow some of the metrics and targets work, if we've talked about the importance of achieving these goals and achieving these objectives, then what exactly is the enticement or the need to do that, and how is that contextualized, and how is that reflected in specific policies? What are the things that you're saying that are important to both incentivize, but also that the incentive itself is signaling that this is a priority, that this is an investment that the firm is interested in and willing to make. We can see here in this from Standard Chartered, one of the ways that they've laid this out is to look at some of the outreach that they have throughout their organization through a number of governing bodies, how often those governing bodies meet. So you have the Climate Risk Management Forum, you have the Group Responsibility and Reputational Risk Committee, you have the Sustainability Fora, and each of those meets a certain number of times per year. Each of them also has defined responsibilities, and we can talk a little bit in the next section about what some of those responsibilities ought to be, what roles various management and board members should take. But here what you have is the areas of discussion topics and also any key decisions taken in that year that would be relevant. And so that's kind of getting back to my point on explaining, what were the impacts, what were the real wins and influences that have come from this. So before we conclude on the good practices piece, keen to hear any questions people have, and then I'll go through a little bit more of the explicit guidance on these two disclosures. Governance is a little bit of a strange section because there's only 2 rather than 3 sub-disclosures, but I think it's a useful one to cover with all of you. So I would talk first about the board, and as you can see, just to tick off a few of these items, what the board committees are, how often they meet, as that being a very basic level. What are the key responsibilities of the board, and how does climate interact and intersect with those? What are the goals and targets that are set? That gets into the metrics and targets, but what is the role of the board? Similar to that question about compensation for management. What are the incentives? How does that work? Also, what training, like what has the board learned, or what skills do they bring? And then finally getting to that point of incentivizing. And again, this is not just purely financial, but also a signaling aspect. What are you willing to commit to, and what are you willing to say when it comes to monitoring and aspiring to reach certain set climate goals? A goal without any sort of binding is not necessarily one that's as strong as one that has clear intermediate steps and incentives. On the management side, I think the key here is to really cover the designated responsibilities. Who are the champions, and what do their teams look like? And within those teams, where are climate issues dealt with? So at the chief risk officer level, at the chief financial officer, how do they interact with climate? What initiatives are they leading? And who on their team is responsible explicitly either for doing the work or being part of that work in terms of the outputs that are generated? The next piece is around monitoring as well. So also what policies and procedures exist that have been written up to empower management to do this, as well as what information is necessary for management to take up in order to make these decisions. Now we get to this term of first and second lines of defense, the first one being the business itself, and the second one being the review or assessment function, typically a model validation or a modeling function relative to the the business line itself, and very often writing the desk procedures for what those different institution or different parts of the institution do is a helpful way not only of clarifying responsibilities, but also of the expectations. And then again, finally, concluding with that point on incentives. So as I said, that's really the overview of good practices. To talk a little bit more about the guiding principles of how we do this governance and how this can happen, that's what I think we'll cover in this next piece. So in terms of governance structures, I think the main point here is some of the things that we've mentioned in terms of good disclosures also apply and are relevant in terms of good governance, and thinking about who is empowered at the board level to manage climate risks. What is the, who is on that committee if there are specific committees, and getting back to this guidance here. In each of the issues, it's not that climate needs to be the only issue, but how is it interacting and relating to these other committees? You may have a committee that is for budget. You may have a committee that is on strategy. You may have a committee on specific initiatives. Is climate being considered there, and how? On that topic, going through here, you have also a need for skills, as I mentioned before. It's necessary not only to talk about the skills, but to have those particular skills on the board, and then also within that board to define what the roles and responsibilities are. And so that's one of the pieces that is particularly important here is effectively defining what the roles and responsibilities are for each individual on the board when it pertains to climate, but also for the committees themselves. At a management level, I think this is where senior leadership, as I said, needs to step up into identifying and addressing climate risks, but also should work similar to the board to be briefed on what those risks are and how those risks can be manifest. So unless you have the right information to make decisions, it's not very easy to be effective on climate as a member of the management team. Where does that information get transmitted? Usually through a number of committees that can then report their perspectives, their actions taken up to the board. There should be really clear guidance going up and down the organization. We'll see that a little bit in the risk management piece tomorrow, but explaining kind of what those links are in the chain between management, climate risk teams, business lines, but really across the board, the idea is that there's a need for interactions to be clarified in this way. And similarly, the roles and responsibilities of each of those members of the management team should be considered. So when we think about guiding principles, I think that it's a combination of knowledge, of accountability, so tying things to incentives and also to public commitments. It's about having the right structure. It's about reporting. It's also about integrating into strategy and understanding what is material and what is not. But fundamentally, at a board level, it is really necessary to think about these different factors and these different